Hey everybody, it is Natalie from Power Moon Tarot. Thank you for being here today. Today I have a special treat for you, and happy Labor Day to everybody out there who is celebrating or at least having the day off. And I know this is, for the United States only people here because the rest of you are not experiencing a holiday today, but nonetheless, welcome and thank you for being here. Let me check my technology here. Perfect. Okay. Well, happy Monday morning to you all. Today is Monday, the day of the moon. And I figured today would be a great day to do a little patriotic webcast. I don't know if I can call it that. I don't know how, quote unquote. I mean, I do support the troops, obviously, but I'm not like, a huge patriot or anything. But but I just wanted to bring you guys, awkward intro, right? I just wanted to bring you guys a chart today that I thought was really, really interesting. And before I dive into that chart, I wanted to show you my new headband that I got. It's like a crystal headband, and it looks like I am like Queen of the Mermaids or something over here. So I wanted to show you guys my new headband too. So happy Labor Day, and hopefully at least you're just, enjoying a day off and things like that today. So thank you for being here. And if you're on the webcast, feel free to say hello and let me know what you think about the webcast in the comments below. Now, for those of you that, some of you may remember your dad or your grandfather or your brother or somebody in your family who liked watching the TV show MASH. MASH aired on television from 1972 to 1983, and it was one of the most popular TV shows ever. And in its final episode in 1983, over 100 million people watched it, which was way more than any TV show ever in time. And so it really kind of like set the precedent for future TV shows. And, a lot of at the time that the show was on TV, the United States was in the middle of the Vietnam War. And the show is actually about a mobile surgical unit during the Korean War. Now, the Korean War was in the 1950s, and so it's an interesting time when the United States was involved in the Vietnam War. This show became really, really popular, and it stayed on the air for a really long time. And a lot of people who had maybe a harder time connecting with their dad emotionally or their grandfather emotionally because maybe they were a little gruffer or a little rough around the edges or something like that. A lot of those types of dads would watch the show MASH, and some kids later on said that was kind of the way that they could connect with their dad, is watching the show MASH. So I think it's kind of interesting. And Pinky, hi Pinky. Pinky's here and said she watched MASH as a child and didn't understand one bit of it. Exactly. And it was kind of a show that your dad or your grandpa or, somebody in your family, your brother, somebody in your family watched. And it was just always playing on the TV all the time. They were 30-minute episodes. And people would get really into the TV show. And so thank you for being here, Pinky. I appreciate that, and your comments as well. So today I'm doing the astrology of your dad's favorite TV show. So that's kind of fun. And let me go ahead and pull up. I wanted to, before I start looking at the chart, I wanted to pull up the main characters of the TV show. Now, this TV show ran for 11 years. At the time, it was a pretty groundbreaking show. At the time in the 1970s, the TV networks were not very flexible, and they were not very open, and they were very conservative. And so MASH kind of became this groundbreaking show because it was about, the Korean War and a mobile surgical unit during the Korean War and everything, but it also had anti-war undertones in it, and it also had kind of like a critique of America in the Cold War. And it had some characters on there. Like one of the characters like was cross-dressing. They had one episode where they kind of tackled, LGBTQ in the military, and these kind of issues, which were just not common in the 1970s to really tackle. And the show was interesting because it was kind of anti-war, although it was about war. And at the time, the networks were not cool with like anti-war messages or anti-war propaganda. And so I think it's kind of interesting how like the show developed over time. And for those of you that know the actor Alan Alda, there he is right there in the middle. I'm putting my mouse around him right now. He was kind of like the main star of the show. Interesting, you'll note there's like a lot of men here, but there's only one woman who is like the head nurse on the show. There were other women that showed up on the show, but like there was only one woman. So it was kind of interesting. Unfortunately, like the show was on in the 1970s, and so there was like a lot of things that probably would be considered harassment towards women today. Like we're on the show, and we'll talk about that when we look at the chart a little bit. But I wanted to show you guys, and some of you probably remember that helicopter scene in the beginning, and there was this kind of like dismal music like playing in the background, and of the show, like when it came on. And the interesting thing about it is that somebody randomly wrote the opening like song for the show, and the opening was called, this name of the song was called I don't know, I don't want to really say the word because it's probably not a good thing to say, but Suicide, I'm saying it the wrong way, but Suicide is Painless was the name of the theme song. And so it was kind of like it was a drama. It was supposed to be a comedy that ended up being more of a drama that talked about kind of the horrors of war, but then there were these wisecracking characters on there who made everybody laugh and brought like a lot of levity to this situation. So MASH, there's the name of the TV show right there, is an acronym for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. It is an American war comedy drama television series. And you might be wondering, like, does a TV show have an astrological chart, Natalie? Yes, it does. And in this case, there is a chart on astro.com for this specific TV show for September 17th, 1972 at 8 p.m., which is when the show first aired. It was on the show for 11 years, and it was on TV for 11 years. The premise is that it's kind of like a dark comedy or a dramedy, and it's an ensemble piece show revolving around key personnel in a United States Army Mobile Surgical Hospital in the Korean War. And so, yeah, it's interesting how it kind of, here's some pictures of them on the show there. And yeah, so let's go ahead, and here's their final episode that was on TV called Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen. The one where like over 100 million people tuned in. And it was like a 2-hour long episode when it finally went off the air. So anyway, let's look at the chart. And now it's interesting because, like I said, it is a mobile surgical unit. So you have to know a little bit about war history to kind of get what was going on the show. So I'll just briefly jump into that. And of course, for my astrology people, you'll notice right away that this is an Aries rising chart. So I mean, when we're talking about a war show, it's pretty perfect having an Aries rising chart. But one thing you kind of have to understand is that eventually in wars, what they would do is, what the United States Army would do is they would have like little hospitals, little makeshift hospitals in tents that would be at the front lines or near the front lines. And when soldiers would get wounded, they would basically go into these tents where there would be actual medical doctors who would patch them up and put them back out on the field again to fight. And so these mobile surgical hospital units were staffed by Army doctors and Army nurses. And as you can imagine, if you're doing surgery on people at the front lines of a war and people are coming and going and you're patching them up and you're sending them right back to the front line to keep fighting, and you're going to see a lot of things, right, that are pretty horrific. Like you're going to see just things that would make you, even though you're not out there doing the fighting yourself, you are helping the people that are fighting. You're taking care of the people that are fighting. And so they come in with a lot of injuries. And so it's a very interesting show. And the show actually does take after a MASH unit that was actually active during the Korean War. And they brought like veterans from the Korean War to help them come up with kind of like situations that were going on during the Korean War and things that they saw and did. And yeah, Pinky says the anime for Naruto, for instance, it was aired in October and it is a sign like Libra, like the main character. Yeah, TV shows definitely have astrology charts, and the actors that play in those charts are all going to be like kind of brought in that way. And Luna Love says, hi, everyone. Can stay for a little while. Love MASH. It's a classic. Yes. Hello, Luna Love. And it is a classic TV show. And it was kind of a way to relate to your grumpy, dad who had a hard time showing his feelings or emotions, or your grandpa or your dad, or, a lot of vets watched that show. And at the time, like I said, when the show came on the air, we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. So it's an interesting show. Now, to get into the astrology a little bit, I would like to show you guys what we have going on. So, of course, I don't know why I just got so interested in this show, but when I found it had like an astrology chart online, I was like, oh, come on now. Like when I first looked at it, I was like, okay, it's a show about war. We've got an Aries rising here. It's a show about wounded warriors. We have Chiron, the astrological body associated with wounds, and nothing says, I'm a wounded warrior with my ascendant in Aries with Chiron conjunction my ascendant. Like that is literally, and especially because the ascendant in astrology represents our physical body and what happens to our physical body. And this whole show is about, a military personnel, an army personnel who are taking care of physically wounded warriors. Physically wounded warrior, Aries rising with Chiron and Aries on top of that ascendant. And so I think that is really interesting, like with the wounded warrior imagery and the fact that like this chart is an Aries rising. And because it is an Aries rising, we want to look at where Mars is in the chart, right? Because Mars rules Aries. So that would be the ruler of the ascendant. And here we see a more perfect, and even more perfect representation of this show, and the fact that it's dealing with, like army nurses and army doctors. And we have Mars and Virgo in the 6th house, right? And the 6th house is where we, we tackle issues like health and surgeries and physical well-being, and doctors and things like that oftentimes have very prominent 6th house placements, or people that deal in healing or wellness, or nurses oftentimes have very packed 6th houses. And with Mercury and Virgo there too, I mean, it's almost like they're real surgeons on the battlefield, like making split decisions, Mercury Mars conjunction, and being extremely detailed and technical with what they're doing, because it's in the sign of Virgo. So it's like these are actors who are playing doctors out on, the battlefield, but are having to perform surgeries and medical procedures under, really stressful circumstances. And, the sixth house in astrology is also a house of stress. And the show kind of like attempted in a way to, in the operating room, would try to, make like jokes and things like that, and whatnot. But at the same time, it's like Alan Alda, who was like the main star of the show, said, we're not just telling stories to amuse you. Like, there are real situations, obviously, that happen with these mobile army hospital units. And so, yeah, like the fact that we have a pileup of planets in the sixth house and the ruler of the ascendant is there. Now, that Mars in Virgo is also in a quincunx to the Aries ascendant, which I think shows the absurdity of it all, because it's like, they would patch people up and help them and try to perform like emergency medical procedures on people, but at the same time, like, they would have to send them back out into the battlefield just to be wounded again. Chiron with the ascendant. And the show talked a lot about that whole thing of like, we're helping people and patching them up and taking care of them, but we have to like basically send these people right back to the front lines to possibly be injured again. And so when you're doing work like that, it can kind of make you feel kind of like hopeless, and who cares about anything. And it can make us feel like, very like weird about our work too, right? Because if the person you worked on is just going to go out into the battlefield and get injured again, what's the point? And dealing with the hopelessness and the helplessness of those kind of situations. And Luna Love says she once considered going into the Army Medical Corps. You were a general nurse. Wow, Luna Love. I did not know that, but I realized I don't do well with people yelling orders at me. Much of ER medicine comes from the military field medicine. Wow. Wow. And this would be a perfect chart. The crazy thing, you guys, is that this is actually just a TV show. But the wild thing about this astrology chart is that this could actually be the chart of a person who went into medical military training and worked in the field of battle. Like, this chart is very, very representative of that, even though it only is a TV show about that. And so I think that is really, really interesting. I also think with the sun in the sixth house and the sun in conjunction there with Mercury, Mars, like, they are true heroes doing that work that they do. And they have to be very clean. They have to be very no nonsense. They have to be very efficient. They have to be very quick. Like, there is a lot of that going on. And, their main thing is to take care of people that have been injured. Chiron with the ascendant there. And the actors themselves talked about the sense of heaviness or responsibility that they felt to kind of show these characters, because like real people actually do these jobs. This is like a job that people did during the Korean War and the Vietnam War and a few wars before that. So yeah, it is absolutely like a real thing. And, art imitating life. You can see the Venus in Leo in the fifth house trining the Neptune in Sagittarius. Like, what a perfect picture of art imitating life. Like, it's so real that it almost scares you. Like, it's so, even though it's a TV show, it's so real that it actually like creates a lot of like maybe even cognitive dissonance, even for vets or people watching that show. But it maybe also help them process emotions as well with the moon in Capricorn. Okay. Now, I think it's interesting that the moon is in the 10th house of career here because, moon in the 10th house can sometimes be people who are in helping professions who, a lot of moon and Capricorn women that I have done consultations for do have like nurse training, doctor training, medical background. And, to be a nurse, like you see things, right? Like you see death on the regular, you see things happening to people all the time, and you can't really have like intense emotional reactions so much to that. You have to be able to keep your emotions in check, and you have to be able to kind of push them aside and do the job that you're there to do, which is very, moon in Capricorn. And so I think, yes. And Pinky says, I have the moon in the 10th, but in Gemini. Yeah. And moon in the 10th people oftentimes do go into some, they have some sort of human caring element in what they're doing. But with the moon in Capricorn here, it's kind of like all business, it's very like business oriented. And the thing that I find really interesting with that moon in Capricorn in the show is that, like, well, the moon in the 10th house for a TV show is talking about a show that's going to be extremely popular. So that is there too. But let me get my line back here. So yeah, so that moon in Capricorn is an interesting one for this show. Also, like, I think it really did. Like, if you think about moon in Capricorn sometimes, it's like practical, get things done. And it's like no nonsense, like nursing and care, right? Because, like I said, if you're a nurse and you've got like 20 patients and you're overrun, you're going to care for all of them, but you can't like be too like crying at every single you know what I mean? You have to keep it together and you have to keep it moving. And so sometimes people say, like, nurses have a way about them that can be like even sometimes a little bit cold, or not all, because I've met some nurses that are like really, really sweet and caring. But like after a while, you have to develop a thick skin and a strong backbone because you're just seeing things all the time. And yeah, and Pinky says that's actually fascinating. I used to work in a mental health clinic answering phones. Yeah. Yeah, caring for the public is very moon in the 10th house, and customer service, helping, patient, caring, all those kinds of things could definitely be moon in the 10th house. And, it's interesting because there's only, in the case of the show, let me show you guys, there was really only one main female character. And when we think of the moon, we can definitely, relate that back to women. But it was this woman here, this blonde haired woman here, and her character on the show was Margaret Hot Lips. They called her Hot Lips. Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan was her name on the show. And, that's a tough, like being in battle, especially in the 1970s, like as a woman being a nurse in a medical military hospital. You got to be a tough woman to do that. And you have to have really, really tough skin. And I think, the moon in Capricorn is a very tough, ambitious woman who's like no nonsense. And it's funny because Margaret's character on the show was like sometimes kind of stiff, and she always followed the rules, and she had like a very tough kind of way about her, and keeping things like disciplined and in order, which is very moon in Capricorn. And but we also saw her like change over the why does it keep doing text there? But you also kind of like saw her change. You can see that the moon is square Uranus in the 7th house. And she was involved in a lot of trysts in the show. And like even though she was like very strict in all business, in the show, she had like an affair with a married man, which is very, Uranus in the 7th house, to like people like getting divorces and having affairs and all of that. So it's interesting because she kind of changes over the show too, and she becomes softer. But with that Uranus and Libra there, the one female character is like very strict, no nonsense nurse who is very ambitious, but also has, problems with maintaining relationships sometimes, Uranus and Libra, because she is kind of like all business. And so I definitely think her character really symbolizes that moon in Capricorn. And she definitely stands out on the show, being like one of the only like female regulars on the cast. And so that is interesting. Now, with that moon in Capricorn too, and I'm going to talk about Rahu, or the North Node, because that moon is in a conjunction with the North Node. But I also want to talk about like the moon in Capricorn a little more in general. And I have some notes here that I wanted to bring to the surface here. And let's see. Let us see. Okay. And, the moon in Capricorn may be more traditional and less willing to show sensitivity. For those of you that grew up with like strict and demanding fathers, or fathers that had like a hard time showing emotion, or fathers that could be kind of gruff, or maybe you had a grandparent like that, or a grandpa like that, or a brother like that. That could be even women too, but I'm just thinking about, dads that are kind of like gruff and don't like talking about their feelings and are kind of like, feelings, like that kind of energy. And, nothing says I have a hard time talking about my feelings like the moon in Capricorn, quincunx Saturn in Gemini in the 3rd house. Check this out, you guys. Let me draw this line here. So we've got the moon in Capricorn at 19 degrees Capricorn, making a quincunx, which is a difficult, awkward relationship, to the Saturn in Gemini in the 3rd house. Okay, so nothing says I have a hard time talking about my feelings and sharing my emotions like the moon in Capricorn, quincunx Saturn in Gemini in the 3rd house. Don't make me talk about my feelings, okay? I don't want to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it, like shoving your feelings down, like no talking about feelings, okay? And a lot of people, like I said earlier, that watch the show, like would find like, their dad, who is like the strong, silent type, would kind of like, finally they had something to relate to their dad on watching that TV show. So I think that that's really interesting with the moon in Capricorn, quincunx Saturn and Gemini. I don't want to talk about my feelings, anything but talking about my feelings, right? And like I said, in professions where you can't be overly emotional all the time and you have to brush things aside and you have to stay professional, that is actually really good to have in your chart. But it can create this feeling of, I don't know how to deal with my emotions. I have to care for these people, moon and Capricorn in the 10th house. I need to care for these soldiers that could, something could be happening to them, but I'm having a hard time dealing with my emotions about that. And so sometimes it comes out in really weird ways, which is the North Node there in Capricorn. Like, there's a moon Rahu or moon North Node conjunction in Capricorn. And I think that kind of creates some like bizarre emotional reactions to like seeing something that is very like sad or very depressing or like very much like in the vein of death and dying, and like how our emotions can become really like different from that of other people. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever been around people where like when something bad happens to them, they just start like laughing hysterically, or they're just, you can tell like emotionally, they're just not like other people. And I almost thought of like the moon in Capricorn and fall in Capricorn quincunxing Saturn conjunction Rahu and squaring the ascendant to be somebody who maybe has like an emotional disability. And not that laughing at funny things, or not that laughing at sad things is like a new thing, or like something quote unquote bad. But I also just feel like, for people that are in like highly caring professions that have to be caring for other people, but are having a very awkward time with their own emotions, or having a very awkward time dealing with other people's emotions. Because it's one thing to be able to go into the heat of battle and like see that somebody's arm is falling off and like sew it back up. It's quite another thing when we realize that we're like emotionally breaking down and emotionally having a really hard time and emotionally like, really dealing with something. And, so we're acting kind of awkward, or we're acting kind of different, or we're having a hard time relating to our emotions because we're in these intense emotional situations, Moon Rahu conjunction, but there's no way to really get those emotions out. And so yeah, I think that is, basically you can be really good at your job, right? Mercury Mars conjunction in Virgo in the 6th house. You can be really like know your job inside out, be really detailed. But when it comes to like someone sitting in front of you and crying, it's like, ugh, I don't know how to deal with that, or somebody getting overly emotional. And so in order to kind of like deal with one's emotions, one may become like very wisecracking, as like an emotional outlet. And you can see that moon is in a trine to the Mercury and the Mars there, which Mercury Mars conjunction in Virgo can be very smart, but also like very wisecracking. And we know those kinds of people that sometimes, like when it's a really intense emotional situation, they start cracking like inappropriate jokes, and you're like, like that type of thing. So we know like that can happen as a way, like we use humor and wisecracking as like levity in situations to deal with like really intense emotional situations. And Luna Lev says, I wonder how the natal charts of the actors. Yeah, you have a theory, especially for long-running shows, that the shows could be cathartic for the actors or help resolve their natal chart karma. Yeah, absolutely, Luna Love, absolutely. And we will look at Alan Alda's chart here in a little bit, and see how his chart is comparing to the chart of the show. And I think that'll be interesting as well. I have a special like affinity for this moon in Capricorn with this Rahu squaring the ascendant, because as you guys know, I've been dealing with a lot of health issues in my life. I've had to have a lot of doctor appointments, and the other day, like I was at a doctor appointment and I was just like awkwardly crying for like no reason, but luckily, there was a really empathetic woman, doctor healer, who was in the room with me and was like, helping me with that and stuff, and wasn't just like making me feel like a leper for like having emotions, So I think that like there is, I'm taking a lot of like messages from this chart myself, and a lot of times we see charts and it's like, oh, I could, even though this is only a TV show, I can see how, something can become more human, right? And with the moon in the 10th house, you really have this idea of things becoming like humanized, or the need to have emotions and compassion about serious issues. But at the same time, with that squaring the ascendant, like getting emotionally burnt out, a lot of people who are in caring and helping professions do get really emotionally burned out and then don't have a way of talking about their feelings. Moon in Capricorn, quincunx Saturn in Gemini. So I think that is a very interesting dynamic that you see. Again, this is just a TV show, but like it is the perfect chart for a doctor working in a surgical unit or a nurse working in a surgical unit. So I was like, yeah, of course. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is, let me erase some of that stuff, is also the South Node in the fourth house. Now, what's interesting in this chart is that, of course, the North Node and the South Node are always opposite to one another. That is obvious. We know that in astrology. But we have to pay attention to what houses Rahu and Ketu are in. And we also want to pay attention to what signs Rahu and Ketu are in. So Rahu is in Capricorn, Saturn sign, and Ketu is in Cancer in the moon sign. And of course the moon and Saturn are ruling the 4th and 10th house in this chart as well. We know the 4th house is our family, and we know the 10th house is our work. And so I think and also the ruler of the 4th house, the moon, is in the 10th house of career. And it really shows that after a while of being away from home, and after a while of working with the same people all the time, they become like our family. And on that show, I'll bring you guys up and sometimes work, there's that whole thing where they're like, oh, we're like a family here. And people are like, ew, I don't want to be like a family with the people that I work with, right? But I mean, sometimes it just happens over time that these actors worked together for 11 years and, they went through a lot together in that 11 years of filming. So it's kind of like your work becomes like your family if you're, spending a lot of time with these people and you're away from home. Which I think is also very true of people who are in the military and are away from their families. Like, you're away long enough, you start to forget about home. South Node in Cancer, you start to forget that you have roots, or that you have a home, or you come from somewhere, and you start to really over identify with your work and the people that you work with, and you start to really feel like the people that I work with are my family. Moon and Capricorn in the 10th house. Okay, the people that I work with are my family. And I'm sure on that show, there probably was a very strong camaraderie with one another, but there's also a job to do with the moon in Capricorn. And they're telling some really difficult stories. All right, ruler of the 10th house, quincunx the moon. And they're telling some really Saturn and Gemini. They're telling some really stories about survival and depression and pain. And oftentimes too, when we see the moon with Rahu like that, there can be issues with mental disturbances. There can be issues with PTSD, or there can be our thinking can get really out of whack because we've been in certain situations for so long. We forgot how to feel our emotions, which is very, moon Rahu conjunction in Capricorn. And, yeah. Yes, and Pinky says crying for no reason is so real. Yes, it is. Oh my God, it is so real. And Luna Love says dark humor is often necessary in these intense situations. Yeah, dark humor. And another thing that I think is very interesting about this show is that there was this whole issue with laugh tracks, okay? And the actors, and especially Alan Alda, who was kind of the main character, he didn't really want these laugh tracks embedded into the show, and neither did the writers. The writers are this is serious business we're talking here. We don't really, and at that time in the 1970s, and all sitcoms, they would have those cheesy ass laugh tracks, right? And can you imagine telling someone with the moon in Capricorn, quincunx Saturn and Gemini, that you have to have a laugh track on their show? I mean, the revolting energy of the laugh track. And I think that, like, I mean, sometimes we need a laugh track because the situation is so absurd, and Saturn can definitely be where we hit our threshold of absurdity and we start just laughing. But I also feel like the writers, particularly of that show with Saturn in the third house, they are not about a frickin' laugh track, okay? And there was a lot of fighting with CBS and with network executives because they were like, put more humor, make it more funny, make it more fun, make everybody laugh. Let's put a laugh track. And the writers of that show with Saturn in the third house in Gemini were like, absolutely not. Like, we don't, like, fuck a laugh track, okay? And so eventually, like, they found a compromise with the executives of the show and had like some laugh tracks, but they made like an agreement with the executives and saying, when we're in the operating room and operating on the patients, there should be no laugh track. Like, if somebody just like, passes away on the operating table, like, for God's sakes, don't put a laugh track after it. This is like weird. So I find that interesting with the laugh track. It's like, come on. And so it was finally like the first time. And I think what people may miss sometimes, even though it was like a traditional show about, military and army and stuff like that, the show was very groundbreaking. And we see this ascendant in Aries opposite the Uranus and Libra. Okay. The show was incredibly groundbreaking because they were like the first TV show to do like a comedy / drama, like a dramedy in like a sitcom format, and not use those laugh tracks all the time constantly. And also the show filmed outside of the studio. So it didn't have the pressure of having a studio audience like a lot of sitcoms did. And that allowed them to be like much more experimental than they had in shows in the past. So there was a lot of, groundbreaking things. And when we think about the energy of Uranus, we can think about, a very like groundbreaking show that kind of like, even though it was about like a really serious topic, right? Capricorn on the cusp of the 10th house, like it was about a really serious topic. It was very groundbreaking in a lot of ways too. And they also had this thing where they experimented with multiple plot lines within 30 minutes. And again, the network executives pushed back and tried to stop them, but they were like, no, we think that the audience is smart enough to follow multiple plot lines. And so they started experimenting with multiple plot lines and found that they were very successful. We see the ruler of the ascendant, that Mars in a conjunction with Mercury and Virgo. Like, our audience is smart. Our audience can follow multiple plot lines. It's fine. And that sense of experimenting is really Uranian, like with the ascendant of the show opposite Uranus, very like freewheeling, freeballing, experimental, like, let's try some new shit here. And Pinky says LOL with the laugh track can feel annoying. Yeah, the laugh track can be annoying, and the writers of this show were like, we don't want a laugh track. They're the writers. And you can see, like, if we're talking about the writers of the show, that would be the third house. And the ruler of the third house is that Gemini. And so we would look to Mercury to represent the writers. So the writers are in a conjunction with Mars. The writers of the show really control a lot here. And the writers can get easily pissed off if they feel like they're not being heard with the ruler of the third house conjunction Mars. Also, the writers are in a square to the Saturn in Gemini. So we're talking about serious, people trying to talk about serious writing. And it's like, I'm not being taken seriously as a writer, but I want you to take me seriously. And the show did have an issue like with changing directions, and Alan Alda actually started like writing some episodes, and things kind of changed when he did, which we can see with the Saturn and Gemini is kind of like having two different writers with the Gemini energy there that kind of take things in a different direction. So yeah, it's interesting with the writer aspect of it. And I didn't research too much into the writers, but I bet they did have a difficult time um, selling their story to the network. And I mean, I know that the show was based off of like a movie, and so the network thought it was going to be really popular, just like the movie. But when the show first came out, it was not popular. So like in year one of the show, when it originally came out, we can see the show itself is represented by the Mars in Virgo is squaring that Saturn in Gemini. So we see the very, very slow start that the show had. The Mars representing the show, Mars in Virgo squaring Saturn. Saturn represent things being like very, very slow to take off. And within its first year of being on air, MASH almost got canceled because it was like a total failure for the first year. Like no one was watching it. And but after time, it started to take off, and it started to do better, and more people became attracted to its message. And yeah, so I think that is interesting with the ascendant being squared to Saturn, or the ruler of the ascendant being squared to Saturn there, and how the show, like, they thought it was going to be really successful, but it really wasn't at first. It almost went off air. It had challenges. There were challenges with the writers. There were challenges with the laugh track. If I can talk today, talk about Saturn in the third house, but exactly, like, challenges with the writers, challenges with the laugh track issue. It wasn't like wildly popular in its first year, but it definitely became more. Luna Love says, I have to leave, but thanks for your insights. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome, Luna Love. So happy you were here. And yeah, Pinky says Gemini has a quirky humor. Absolutely. And you can see that Uranus is also in a trine to that Saturn and Gemini. So there were some things that they were able to get away with as far as like writing in a character that was like a cross-dresser, writing in a character that was LGBTQ. There were some ways that they could kind of bend the rules and go a different direction. But yeah, it was a very slow start to begin with the Mars squaring the Saturn there. Like it had some problems getting its feet off the ground for sure. And like I said, with the ruler of the fourth house of family and the 10th house of career, I think working together for so long, the actors became like a family. And interestingly, like the show really didn't go into the family background too much of the characters. It was mainly like about work and the connections and the camaraderie that they had due to going through these really intense experiences together at work. And so it's almost like where they came from or their families of origin, like all that kind of stuff on the TV show was really like forgotten and pushed under the rug, which is very much, K2 in the fourth house, like kind of like, especially in Cancer, like losing a sense of belonging or not really having like a home or a foundation, like it kind of, and that was, with MASH units, that's how it was. They would have to like pick up their unit and physically move it and follow like wherever the army was going. And they had to like, real MASH units really had to do that. And they did not really like have a quote unquote home. And that is very much, the South Node in Cancer type of a thing, which could also be like a secret longing for home or wanting to go home, but you can't because you have a job to do. Ruler of the fourth house in the 10th house. Like I have a mission. I have a job to do here. I can't just like bail out and go home type of thing. Um, so I think that that is a very interesting analysis of the show. Also, the other thing I kind of pointed out earlier with the Uranus in the seventh house of partnerships, a lot of people on that TV show, like, I don't know about the actors themselves in their real lives, but the actors on the TV show, a lot of them were having um, like extramarital affairs, and a lot of them were wanting their affair partner to like, you know, divorce and marry them, and that was a lot of the characters on the show were very much about that energy. I don't know that they were in real life, but and actually I think Alan Alda in real life would um like really was like a family man who wanted to spend a lot of time with his family. So I don't know that that was like the real life story, but like in the show itself, like a lot of people were cheating, and a lot of like, you know, a lot of the like wacky stuff or the weird stuff had to do with like relationships and hooking up, and people like being with other people and stuff like that. So you saw a lot of that, you know, Uranian kind of stuff going on, more or less in like the relationship aspect of the TV show. And what else did I want to say? I mean, I also think it's interesting that the show is opposite Uranus, because they really were writing like a risky line there. They were like a, you know, at the time, there wasn't really allowed to be on TV during the Vietnam War any anti-war sentiment. Like I said earlier, the networks were very like conservative, and they didn't really allow that. And so MASH, being an Aries rising, really kind of like rode that line opposite Uranus. Like I feel like they kind of got away with certain things, and they kind of would like bend the rules, and they would, I think because people liked the show so much with the Moon Rahu conjunction, that like the show was very popular, so they could get away with things. And like the show's main character, Alan Alda, played kind of like a fool, trickster, kind of, you know, thumbing his nose at the institutions of society, right? That's very Aries rising opposite Uranus, while at the same time appealing with the moon and Capricorn in the 10th house, like appealing to a lot of people and becoming really popular. So I find that interesting as well. And yeah, Wilden. Yeah, Pinky says LMAO. They were like Wilden. Yeah, definitely on the show, like, you know, wilding out and doing some sneaky. You see Pluto in the 7th house there too, like of Libra, like wilding out and doing some sneaky Plutonian secret stuff romantically. The show, they say like that the show never really had a problem like confronting death, and you can see that Sun in Virgo is about ready to move into Libra, and is on like that Sun in Virgo is about 4 or 5 degrees from hitting the Pluto conjunction. Okay. And what's interesting in astrology, there is something called solar arc, like solar arcs. And, you know, here's a really big book on solar arcs in astrology. And what solar arcs say is that our chart is progressing, like every planet in our chart is progressing 1 degree for every year. And a lot of times solar arcs are used along with progressions and things like that when doing predictive work in astrology, used with transits. And what's interesting is that, you know, eventually, like about 4 years into the show, that it became more focused on like death and like the seriousness of what was going on, and the laugh tracks started going away more. That was after like the first 3 or 4 years after that show, and that would have been after the sun had solar arced out of Virgo and moved into the conjunction with the Pluto, the natal Pluto in Libra. And so I think that that progression over the first, 3 to 5 years of the show is really interesting in the fact that it became darker, like it became more plutonic over the first like 3 to 4 years that the show was on. After that first 3 to 4 years, the show became like far more plutonic, and like darker underworld type of stuff as time went on. And I think it's also interesting with the moon Rahu conjunction at the top of the chart here in the 10th house, about because Rahu is very much like political and can talk about making a big political contribution to something. And with the moon there, I think, the show is a big political commentary without directly doing it, and I think that that is interesting. Like the show is, even though it is a show about war, it has a lot of like political commentary about the dangers and the issues of war in society, which I think is interesting. So anyway, everybody, I know this was a shorter webcast, but my goal was to make it like quicker, faster, more digestible. And actually, quickly before I go, I want to show you the chart of Alan Alda, because I said I was going to do that. Here is Alan Alda's chart, the second ring here, and he was like the main star of the show for like 11 years. He even wrote some episodes of the show as well. And immediately, like what popped out at me was the fact that his north node in Capricorn is right on the midheaven of that show. Would you look at that? Okay, like his own Rahu north node, the main stars, is right on the midheaven of the show. And Alan Alda is also a Capricorn rising, and we know that. So his angles, and he has Alan Alda also has the moon in Aries. So he's a very Capricorn Aries person, and the show is very Capricorn Aries. So anything, Alan Alda has his angles in cardinal signs, which would be Capricorn, Aries, Libra, and Cancer. So he has planets on the cardinal angles, and the show is also like heavily cardinal angled as well. So anytime the cardinal angles were getting transits, Alan Alda would be feeling it and the show would be feeling it. I mean, his destiny with the Rahu there on the midheaven of the show was definitely like closely intertwined with that show. And, his moon in Aries and everything as well, like very tied into the ascendant of that show. And his, his Pluto in Cancer is also right on that K2 there as well. So his like nodes of fate are very much aligned with that TV show. I didn't want to go like too far into it with his chart, but I just wanted to point out to you that his north node is literally in a conjunction with the midheaven of the show. And he was kind of like a guiding force to that show all throughout his time on that show, which was basically the entire time. So I think that that is really kind of interesting about Alan Alda's chart as well. And I think with that, I am going to go ahead and leave it there. I hope you guys enjoyed the webcast, and I thank you so very much for joining me. And if you have any comments about the stream, I would love to hear them. Thank you so much, and happy Labor Day, everybody. Take care.